Hello and welcome to the Chapter 13-14 test review, Medieval Times. Guys, it's been a great school year and it's been a lot of fun. Don't forget, once World Civ, always World Civ, so you're always welcome to come back and say hi during current events or jump into a Kahoot if you happen to have a free period and you get a pass to come down. So, it has been a very fun year, and let's finish strong. And here we go. Let's review some Medieval Times. So, first of all, Medieval Times, Middle Ages as it's often called. What in the world just happened? Okay, let's go back. This is a one-take video, so we're not going to refilm that. 500 to 1500 AD is typically what we think of. When historians classify this, there are generally speaking three things that they look at. Number one, Roman heritage. And what that means is that medieval Europe basically evolves out of Roman culture and Roman provinces and way of life. Number two, the beliefs of the Roman Catholic Church, which will be the one constant thing during the entire medieval ages, is the Roman Catholic Church. And number three, the customs of the Germanic tribes, which will blend with Roman culture and make a brand new society. And so here we see typical medieval town. Obviously peasants, you have serfs, they're called. You have a castle, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. So the effects of the 600s. Okay, so after the fall of Rome, Germanic tribes basically invaded and took over Europe. They also took over Rome as well. They actually looted Rome. But basically trade routes were disrupted because there was so much war going on with these different Germanic tribes that were competing for power. Cities were basically brought to an end. A lot of them were. Some were abandoned. And people started population shifting, meaning they're moving to the countryside. They actually left their homes and estates and went to the countryside. And that was my cat, by the way, jumping over my head. That's what that bell was. You heard that. And now it's sitting right up by my head. Anyways, how and why did language in Europe change? Well, basically Germanic people are going to start speaking Latin, and basically new dialects of Roman Latin are going to form. And that's where you get like your typical, German, French, different versions of European languages. Germanic tribes kind of just believed in family. They didn't really believe in nationhood or citizenship. They controlled territories, but they weren't really bound by like a central government necessarily until one particular Germanic tribe called the Franks. Franks basically lived in what is now France and Western Germany. Clovis was the first Christian king of the Franks. So we'll talk about the Franks more in a second. But basically, the Catholic Church was spreading its influence while these different Germanic kingdoms were going on. Catholic Church did assert its authority as well by building churches all throughout Europe and then basically stating that wherever there were churches, that was where they ruled. And so it was like governments competing against each other, or rather tribes competing against each other, but also the Catholic Church trying to maintain authority as well. So there was a guy named Pepin the Short, and not a very big fella, but he was king of the Franks after Clovis, one of the kings, and he actually defended Rome from the Lombards. And so he wasn't just a Christian by name, he actually did something for the Pope, and so therefore the Pope called him king by the grace of God. And so the Franks have gone from just being like having a Christian ruler to now their ruler is defending the Pope. And then finally came a guy named Charlemagne. And Charlemagne was a good friend of the Pope, Pope Leo, and did some favors for the Pope, and the Pope in turn declared him to be king. And so the fact that this happened showed that there was an alliance between the church and the Frankish kingdom, which became the most powerful of the Germanic tribes. So this early on in the medieval times, the Germanic kingdom of the Franks became the most powerful. That doesn't mean they're the only one. There was tons of other ones as well. But this is the first one to really align with the Catholic Church. It combined, Germanic power, power of the Church, and the legacy of Rome. So these three things became one. But unfortunately, Charlemagne's kingdom kind of fell apart after he died, because he left it to his son, who passed it on to his three sons, who had very little leadership skills. And so after the Frankish kingdom falls apart, Europe falls into what's called feudalism. After the Franks kind of dissipate, three groups began to invade Europe. One, or the Muslim soldiers or warriors coming in from North Africa and the Middle East. The other is a group called the Magyars. And finally, you got the Vikings, okay, coming in from the north. The Varangians, the Vikings, coming in from the north. And so these invasions, with the lack of central authority with the Frankish kingdom disappearing, these invasions are going to cause disorder. Kings can no longer protect their citizens, and it leads to something called feudalism. Okay? So in this system, peasants begin exchanging, the poor start selling their land to lords, who then say, I'll protect you as a result of this. And then lords, sometimes known as knights, are given what's called fiefs in exchange for loyalty. Okay, so the lowest of the low, the peasants, are giving up their lands for protection. Then there's lords who are actually given, they go to higher lords or kings, and those kings or higher lords say to the lower lords, well, if you join my army, you're a good sir knight, I will give you a fief, which is a payment of land. And then as a result, they pledge their loyalty and become a vassal of that king. So that's the difference between a landowner, a fief, and a vassal. Okay. Now, this pyramid does get really confusing. Okay. Feudal pyramid is really confusing thing. So looking at this, yes, kings are at the top, nobles, lords, ladies, knights, peasants, and serfs. In between here is actually guilds, so like blacksmiths, specified workers, and then knights, and then lords and ladies. Sometimes there's actually like lesser lords, higher lords, kings, lesser kings, and there's always someone at the top. And so just so you understand, this is a very basic understanding of this. The lower level is called peasant or serf. So now lords typically lived on what's called a manor. Kings and queens have castles. Lords, in some cases, lords had castles as well, but this is just an example of like a local feudal lord. They're going to have their own church. Payment of 10% to the village priest is required of citizens. And they usually live in a manor, fortified hilltop, a castle. They're going to have a little village that they're in charge of. In fact, if you became a knight also, you became a lord, and if you served a powerful king, he would sometimes give you like a mansion and several villages you'd have to watch. But yeah, they treated the peasants horribly, so their average lifespan was only 35. But saddles and stirrups were used by medieval knights. Now, knights first appeared in around 700s in Charlemagne's army. Then they became the standard foot soldier by the Middle Age. But they were able to maneuver on horses a lot more effectively because for the first time in history, they created saddles and used the stirrups for steering and leaning and stuff. There's another diagram of a manor system. So kings usually required about 40 days of service for knights per year. Knights were required to show obligation to heavenly lord, feudal lord, his lady of choice. That's called the Code of Chivalry, which is a whole series of laws that govern how knights should behave. A squire was actually just below the knight, and below that is page. That's the different rankings. Knights usually were written about during the medieval times, poems, songs, but normally these poems and songs glorified knighthood and left out a lot of the dark stuff. The troubadours oftentimes accompanied knights or just went from castle to castle and displayed their artistic and musical abilities. They sang of the heroic tales of knights like St. George around 300, which was actually around before knights even existed, who supposedly killed a dragon to save a princess. So St. George is a Catholic saint. But speaking of Catholicism, the Catholic Church was very powerful during medieval times, led by the Pope. Bishops administered several churches, and then priests were usually an individual church. Sacraments, so all medieval citizens were required, if they were members of the baptized Catholic, they were required to be part of the Catholic Church. The sacraments were, and they were the pathway to salvation and eternal life according to the Catholic Church. And not all Christians necessarily agree on those doctrinal stances, but that's what the medieval Catholic Church believed. So that would be baptism, the communion, all that stuff. What is the basic definition for canon law? So this is the laws of the church. So wherever the church had churches, that's where they had power. And so you got into a situation where there was actually some kings actually tried to stand up against popes, but turns out that the popes were actually stronger than the kings, and they kind of put them in their place. So after the fall of Charlemagne's kingdom, things get kind of crazy for a couple hundred years. Then another really powerful kingdom emerges. Now, the rest of Europe is still dotted with feudalism here. But a guy named Otto I becomes powerful in Germany. And 962, he begins to unite all of these different Germanic tribes, okay? And he fights against these princes to regain basically a lot of the territory that Charlemagne had owned. Now, Charlemagne was more over here, but they did own some of this territory. Some of those Germanic tribes that were part of Charlemagne's kingdom and ones that weren't are united. And but yeah, so this empire becomes known as the Holy Roman Empire because again they do some favors for the Pope and defend the Pope, and there becomes an alliance between Germany and Italy. So looking here, now Pope Gregory had some conflict with a German king, King Henry IV from this kingdom, the Holy Roman Empire. Gregory basically told Henry not to appoint bishops, and he said, I'm going to do it anyways. And in fact, Henry told Gregory to step down, and eventually got into this big conflict. Gregory excommunicated Henry, and Henry begged for forgiveness and had to stay out in the snow and almost died. But it was an embarrassment and showed that the Pope was actually more powerful than the king. King Frederick I of Germany, the Great Crusader, his nickname was Barbarossa. There he is, a picture. We don't really have time to talk about him because we're running out of time. Castle warfare, siege, arrow volley, wall defenses, catapults, all kinds of stuff. We've talked about that in great detail, but don't really have time in this video because we're actually running out of time. There's the answers for 33 through 35. Gothic cathedrals had a brand new style. Friars traveled around preaching to the poor. Lay investiture was when kings tried to appoint bishops, but yeah, that was, again, seen as corruption by the Catholic Church. These huge churches were actually Germanic style. They had pointed arches. And just to show you how the Catholic Church and the Germanic style, like from the Holy Roman Empire, they kind of combined cultures. So these churches often had Bible stories. Two goals of the Crusades: regain control of the Holy Land from Palestine from Muslim occupants, and reunite Eastern and Western Christianity. Pretty horrible wars. The Catholic Church has since apologized. It lasts about 300 years, and the Christian knights, the Crusaders, as seen on the right, failed to retake it. In fact, Pope Urban II told everybody that they would get a place in heaven for fighting. The only crusade that was somewhat successful was the first one, where they captured a 650-mile strip of land, captured Jerusalem, but both of those are shortly retaken. Antioch was an absolute bloodbath where they revert to cannibalism to survive and slaughter men, women, and children, which is largely what they do in the Crusades. Absolutely horrible. The Second Crusade, they try to retake Jerusalem and fail. Third Crusade, these three guys, Philip, Frederick, and Richard, the Lionheart, fight against a Muslim warrior named Saladin. Frederick actually never makes it. He drowns in a river. Philip chickens out. Richard ends up having to sign an alliance or a treaty with Saladin and never completes his mission. There you go. You can see the conditions of the treaty. The Children's Crusade. Spain was controlled by the Moors at one point during the Crusades. After they kicked the Moors out, they had, trials looking for heretics, supposedly. There's the 100 Years' War. You can read through that. I would encourage you to do so. Joan of Arc. Unfortunately, we're just about out of time. I have a 15-minute limit for my videos, so there's that. Effects of the Crusades. And finally, this, the bubonic plague.